for more information.
Well, hey, so it's Phil and David with you today, and we're going to continue our series on great to good with some questions today about worship and really asking what is the good in worship? What does good worship look like? Phil, I think that that's a really important question for us to ask at the moment because worship has been through really interesting journeys, both in the last kind of 20, 30 years, but actually also in the last 18 months, where our worship journey corporately has narrowed its way down into we sit in our bathrobe and watch and watch YouTube channels of different people singing to us. And so now we're at this point where we're emerging out of the pandemic lockdowns at the level that they were, and we're gathering again in rooms. And it feels like this leads us to an appropriate time to ask the question, well, what is worship? We've moved away from watching on YouTube to being back in a space again, but it feels like a good time to ask that question. Well, what are we actually doing when we gather together as a community, as a church, and engage in this thing called worship?
Yeah. A deeply necessary question. David, like you said, now necessary coming out of the pandemic, but also a question I think that we've needed to wrestle with for a long time. And part of the reason that it's so necessary is if we're unclear about what it is we're actually doing when we come together, then we can get ourselves into all kinds of problems. And I think that one of the first things for me that is really important to talk about in worship is that worship is a response. Because oftentimes what we start with is, what is it that I'm doing? And this plays out in all kinds of interesting ways. I mean, growing up in a Pentecostal context, not everything that I saw was unhealthy by any means, but one of the things that you would see in some situations and places was that we almost felt as if we had to work ourselves up into a state of worship. That, one of two things, that we would either have to bring God down, and if we, I mean, it's an awful lot like Baal worship in the scripture, and less like Christian worship. But if we could, be spiritual enough and do the right things, we could bring God down, or alternatively, we could maybe elevate ourselves up towards God.
Yes.
And even as a young worship leader, I remember the pressure of that. Self-imposed pressure, really, but the pressure of, if I don't do just the right things, then this won't be great. I think worship starts with an understanding, though, that God has acted first, and has drawn us into the very life of God. And so our worship is a response. We often talk about finding, I found that when I found Jesus, and there's nothing wrong with people saying that, but the truth is we didn't find Jesus. Jesus found us, and we respond. And then I think there's appropriate ways to talk about what it is that we do in response as a community. And, one of the dangers is that we think of, if there's 200 or 800 of us gathered on a Sunday morning, then it's often a temptation to think of 800 individual expressions with me and Jesus coming together. But really, what we're doing is we're collectively coming together, lifting our voices together, lifting our hearts together, and being shaped in a particular way towards Jesus and in and around the story of Jesus. So when we sing, and it's really hard to get away from this language, actually, of talking about worship as a segment of the service. I find it hard to even talk appropriately about this. But the sermon is worship. The reading of the creeds, the reading of the scripture, it's all worship. And so we come together centered around Jesus, centered around his story, to collectively lift up our hearts in response to what Jesus has done in and through us, and to lift our attention back toward Jesus.
I mean, just to echo really what you've said, because I think it's so significant, that idea of worship on the behalf on my part being the second move, I think is really, really important, and I wouldn't want that to get missed in all of the sort of things that we're going to be saying. Is that it is our response? It's something that we
Yes.
do, but like you say, not simply something that I do, but something that we do. I remember
Yes.
some years ago now being in a worship gathering, and the person leading said, we're here, and what I want you to do is just close your eyes, forget about everybody else, and this is just a time for you and Jesus. And I remember thinking, well, it's really strange that we've all come from all over the place to be in this one room, and now we're being told, pretend nobody else is here. It felt to me like, well, I can do that anywhere. But when
Yes.
I'm gathered together with other, brothers and sisters of the faith, surely we should identify the corporate nature of that,
Yeah.
and the togetherness that's found in that. And so this idea is actually quite simple to say, that the worship is focused on Jesus as a response to Jesus. And therefore worship isn't directly focused on me. If that is that you comfortable with me saying it that way? Do
Yeah.
you think
Yeah.
that?
Absolutely.
So that actually quite changes the parameters of what we think is happening and what I'm looking for in a time of worship. Whereas
Yes.
my experience in a lot of contexts has been that worship is a journey that I am judging based on my own emotional engagement with it. And sometimes, actually, even from the worship leader themselves, it can feel like worship is more about the emotions of us worshiping than it is about what are we getting or giving in response to Jesus. Is that,
Yeah.
I mean, am I scratching at something there you think is
Oh,
valid to think about?
absolutely. Absolutely. And it's hard a lot of times for us to talk well about this, I think, because we set it up as an either or, that, so worship then is the stifling of emotions, where it's like, no, it's actually, the focus is not the emotion, like the elevating or not elevating at all. It's on Jesus, which means we're human. We have emotions and we will be met with them. The problem is when we make it about an emotional experience, then, I heard, I think Ian Morgan Cron once talk about this, of we come in and we have an emotional experience, and this is good. I often react emotionally. But if that then becomes the expectation, then what happens the next Sunday? The next Sunday is, I experience that. I need to experience it again. And it can actually become like a drug, where like you actually need a greater hit, right?
Yes.
The longer that you go on. And so we end up then trying to produce these, and I think oftentimes unintentionally, but produce these emotional experiences rather than we're responding to the God who moves the human heart. And there are times, Eugene Peterson talked about the way that we often, our problem is that we think that we can feel our way into worship. And in fact, that maybe if I'm not feeling it, then it's inauthentic, right? For me to engage that. He says worship works the other way around. That we worship our way into changing the emotion, into these other things, rather than I have to have this emotional response and therefore I will worship. He said, no, worship, even when we don't feel any emotion, worship is changing us precisely because it is a response. And so we turn up on a Sunday morning. I sound like you now using the word turn up, but we turn up on I would normally say show up, but we've been hanging out a lot more. So, but you see who turns up on a Sunday, and for us, it's like, well, where's my heart at today? Maybe I'll come, maybe I won't. Maybe I'll sing, maybe I won't. If the song's particularly moving, I'll respond. Whereas worship, it works the other way around, which is very counterintuitive to most of us, I think. We present our hearts to Jesus, with Jesus,
Hmm.
over and over again, week after week. And somehow God is shaping us, whether we feel it or not. And sometimes we will feel it. And sometimes it's strange moments. And other times we won't feel a thing. And the temptation is to walk out and say, well, nothing happened. Well,
Hmm.
actually, the Spirit of God has been working in our hearts that whole time. And it has nothing to do with emotion. Our emotions betray us. But this is why it's important, I think, to come back to what worship truly is. What is the heart of it? Otherwise, we're trying to produce other things instead of response.
And this seems hugely significant. I was thinking, like in last week's teaching, I talked about how David Brooks identifies that our culture is increasingly becoming more and more narcissistic, and I don't feel like Brooks deserves any medals for identifying that. I feel like one trip on the subway and you come to that conclusion.
Mm.
But given that we're heading towards a pathway of being more and more narcissistic, then if our frame of worship is, what do I get from this, and am I emotionally engaged with this, and is this doing what I want? That could be quite a dangerous mix, couldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Adding this potentially misconstrued notion of worship to a already very egotistical society. I was listening to Brian Zand, who said something recently about prayer, but I think it applies to worship as well. That Zand was talking about how a lack of structure in prayer means that we will define and decide what our prayers look like based on where we're currently at. So he said, if you're a very selfish person, guess what? Your prayers will be very selfish. And the reason why we come to church and gather together as a community and have people lead us is that sometimes they lead us places that we don't necessarily want to go, places that we wouldn't naturally go. Because, I would turn up as a very selfish person and all of a sudden be asked to pray or worship about something that might not be directly what I want to talk about, think about. And I think there's some depth in that, but it's quite a shift for most of us, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's when we focus on the community, we all come with different experiences, different emotions. It's some of us, this is the beauty. I remember years ago, we celebrated the Lord's Supper together. And we, on this particular night, this is when we lived in Georgia, there was a long lineup to receive. And I remember looking and being shocked at, oh my goodness, there's those people, they just have announced that their son's cancer is in remission. Whereas those people over there, I just buried their child. And these people have just gotten married. And then I saw these other people over there. I thought, they're that person's newly divorced. And so here we were all in a lineup. And what's amazing about corporate worship is that actually all of that belongs. The danger is when we bring our own experience to the center. In worship, when it centers around Jesus, and there's a way to do this actually with Jesus, where we only want to talk about one part of Jesus' life. But when we actually do center ourselves around the entirety of Jesus' life, who Jesus is, his resurrection, but also his death, his coming at Christmas, but also in Advent, the longing for his coming and that silence, is that it makes space for us all throughout the year. And I do believe that part of the, you talked about this idea of closing our eyes, this invitation, close your eyes, pretend nobody else is here. I actually believe that part of the beauty of corporate worship is that we lend faith to one another in difficult times.
Beautiful phrase.
And because life is both mountain and valley, sometimes very close together, there are times where I can lend my faith to you and other times where you can lend your faith to me. Marissa, when she's helping to train worship leaders, she will tell them the opposite of what you were told. Look out and see. She said, I'll see the young mom with her
Mm.
baby, and I know she's exhausted. And I remember what it was like to be in that place. And I'm singing to God, but I'm also trying to um, remember her in this moment.
Mm.
And, it's a prayer, like strengthen her. And so, as we do that around Jesus rather than our own emotion, our
Mm.
own life situation, frankly, it will at times feel disruptive.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going through grief. I don't want to come and sing the happy song
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah.
Um, but what liturgy, and we may talk about that, does is that it ensures that we don't always sing the happy song.
Mm.
And so, because we're centered around the life and the story of Jesus, so all emotion belong, but it is the life of Jesus and the experience of Jesus at the center, and we can
Mm.
throw our lives, our sorrows, our joys upon Him rather than insisting. And it's easy to do this as a worship leader, as a pastor, um, to insist others have to dive into my emotion at the
Mm.
moment. Um, that's not my job. It doesn't mean I don't feel that emotion. My job is to bring us all toward Jesus and to throw all of our emotion or non-emotion, maybe whatever it is, at the feet of Jesus and
Mm.
experience Him together, and somehow be built up together. Not just
Mm.
my own heart, but all of us. The glory of the Lord being reflected on your face and mine, and the person over
Mm.
there, and um, and there's actually more to be experienced through that, I think.
The you when we were talking about worship before we were recording, you mentioned Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 16 as kind of an interesting text that might guide us through this particular conversation.
Mm.
Can I read it just now? And
Please.
so Jeremiah 6 in verse 16, it reads like this. It says, "Thus says the Lord, stand at the crossroads and look, and ask for the ancient paths, where the good way lies, and walk in it, and
Mm.
find rest for your souls." Let me just read that
Yeah.
again, because I think there's some real power in there. "Stand at the crossroads and look, and ask for the ancient paths, where the good way lies, and walk in it, and find rest for your souls." Um, and so there's a passage there that I feel is a really interesting one for us, even for us at Westside, as we're trying to sort of navigate our way into a sort of recovery from YouTube worship. And I don't, please, like YouTube worship helped us through a period of time. Like there was days
Yeah.
where we sat down and thought, "Oh my goodness, if this is what we've got, this is what we've got, and this is what we need." But it does present us with a moment as we step out of that, doesn't it? To think, are we at a crossroads, and what is the way for us to think more deeply about worship that in the way that we're talking about just now? So talk to me about that text a little bit. What sort of where do you want to go with that?
Yeah. I've been thinking about this text a lot.
Mm.
I think that it's undeniable that we are at a crossroads
Mm.
as a church right now. And I think some of this has been coming for a long time.
Mm.
Well, what the pandemic has done, and people might disagree with this, but I truly believe that things that would have unraveled maybe in a generation or two have unraveled in the space of 2 years.
Mhm.
Um, because the pandemic came and it forced us in a day
Mhm.
um, to confront the things that were on autopilot for a long time and that we
Yes.
trusted in and thought, well, it works, right? Um, and so the church finds herself at a crossroads at this moment. And
Mm.
the question is, what do we do?
Mm.
What do what do we do? We have goodness. And it's not just like one church, it's all of us
Yes.
that are at this moment of like, well, goodness, we used to have 800 people, now 200 show up, and we're actually rejoicing that 200 show up. But then you think about that in a larger kind of frame, like we don't want that has an impact on our city, has an impact on our
Mm.
families, all these things. What do we do? And I think for the longest time, we kept looking for what's the new thing,
Mm.
and we would talk about models. Uh, what church is doing great things that we can model. And what's interesting here is that Jeremiah finds himself at a crossroads.
Mm.
And the Lord says, stand at the crossroads and look. And it's not look for the new church model, look for the new thing that's happening, but ask for the ancient paths.
Mm.
Ask where the good way is, not the good way forward. Of course, we go forward, but we go forward by moving in reverse in a sense. By looking back is the only way to go forward. What is the good way? And walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. And then, of course, the people said, we will not walk in it. And there is this thing. For me, I truly believe that when we talk about the good is not going to be, we're at too much of a crossroads to think that some church is going to show us some new way to use technology and everything's going to be fine, or some, do this program and suddenly your church will be full. I think we're beyond that. And maybe I think we need to be beyond that. But at the crossroads, what we can do is look back and see what is it we've lost along the way. And how can we return to the good path that, we talk about the church. When we worship, there's a mysterious way in which we're not just worshiping even with the people in the building, right? We can see the shallowness of just me by myself in the building, even though I'm surrounded by other people.
Yes.
That becomes all the more shallow when you realize that we are joined actually with the church who has gone before us for 2,000 years. We are joined by the great cloud of witnesses, as Hebrew talks about. And so we can look back at the wisdom and the practices of people who have gone before us and find wisdom and goodness there and rest. And rest.
And so, just pushing a little bit of this crossroads question and the question of where we're at, and I'm probably going to be slightly unfair and hugely reductionist here, but to me, if I look over the sort of 20 years of my life in Christian ministry, we've seen this move happen with corporate worship, where the quality of worship that is happening in terms of musically is going up and up and up. But then the creativity of worship, while going up at some level, is narrowing at another level. So creativity became just whoever happened to be on the stage, they were bringing the creativity. And increasingly congregations were becoming observers rather than participants in the story. So, and you see church analysts are talking about this all over the world, how the singing congregation is getting less and less and less. And sort of worship starts to involve arrangements that are hard to sing along to, keys and approaches that are hard for the average non-singer, like me to keep up with. And so there's this subtle sense. And then also even congregations are being placed further and further in the dark while lights are turned up and up on the stage. There's this increasingly starting to feel more like I'm an observer at a gig than a participant in a time of worship. And so then one of my great fears was when the pandemic started, was actually how easy it was for churches to move to this sort of YouTube model. That all of a sudden now you keep sitting there and we'll keep just providing content to you. To me, that how easy that jump was. I know there was technical challenges with it, but in terms of taking what we do on a Sunday and turning it into a online service was actually quite straightforward for a lot of churches, for a lot of communities. And the challenge for me was that we were at this point in the story of our lives where I didn't really want to turn on my YouTube channel and see a lot of creativity. I didn't really want to just watch another nice song being sung. I was looking for something deeper, right? And perhaps what Jeremiah would call an ancient path, something that would speak to me, something that would bring me in a way of truth, but actually call me into that. So when I've talked to you about this in the past, you shared then an experience you had where you just jumped onto Facebook Live early on in the pandemic. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that experience and how you've kind of navigated and learned from that.
Yeah. And, I'll state here that I mean, I'm a musician, so I care about good music. I care about good quality.
Yeah.
I care about all these things. But it did strike me almost immediately in the pandemic that I'm curious if we're going to just do that, try to keep replicating the show, or if we'll move towards something different. And Marissa, at the beginning, now everybody's just angry with each other, but previously we were afraid, and we, I remember saying to my kids, we will probably know somebody who dies from this, and they just, we're all crying around the table. And Marissa said, I really feel like we should, go on Facebook Live and just sing a few worship songs. And to be honest, David, there's like nothing in me that wanted to do that. You're pretty vulnerable on Facebook Live. It's like the worst sound. It's the, but I said, okay, we'll do it. And so we set up the keyboard and just turn the thing on. And plus, you're always like, who cares if I'm, if I'm playing the piano or whatever. But man, it had nothing to do with music quality, had nothing to do with any of that. We had like 5,000 views in no time, and people were on there and then reaching out to us like, we're in our home crying right now. We need this. We needed this. And it wasn't really about the, I don't know. They knew that we were doing it live and it wasn't going to be, perfect. It wasn't going to be great. But there was a goodness we experienced because there was a hope. We were gathering again, singing songs about Jesus.
Yeah.
That anchored us in that moment. And this is the thing, is that we need an anchoring for our souls right now. And we need a familiarity, I think, actually. And I love new. We write songs, we do these things. Part of things, we're reciting the creed a lot now. And part of what we would do is revisit these songs that people actually knew, but they knew it in a different way because they're approaching. And this is, I think, the argument sometimes against new is people say, nobody wants the same thing over and over again. It's why people don't take communion every while. What if it gets stale? It's like, oh my goodness. And we can't be singing kind of the same songs. And again, I love new songs. We write new songs. We sing new songs. But what happens is that when we do the same thing over and over again, while it stays the same, we change.
Yeah.
And so we're at a new point in the story of our own lives, and we come back around to it, and it's familiar enough that we can sing it and we know the words and the lines. But because we're hitting it in a new place, maybe of fear, like at the beginning of the pandemic, and sorrow of what has happened to our world, it anchors us in a way that it's familiar enough that it can come out of us. Like I began writing these pandemic prayers and had other people writing pandemic prayers during the pandemic. And, I'd be writing these, and then all of a sudden, true light from true, God from God, light from light, true light from true light was just immediate, without even thinking, was just coming out, or I was just writing it. And it's because the creed had gotten in me. But that at that point was what I needed. And when I needed it, and this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, when I needed it, the thing that didn't connect with me emotionally, maybe for years, my life hit this new point, our society hit this new point, and suddenly that thing was in there, even when I didn't realize that it was in there. And when I needed it most, it came out. And that's the beauty of worship that centers around the story of Jesus again and again. The creed, we say it all the time. It doesn't change. The beauty of it's not that it's new every week. The beauty of it is that while we're new every week, actually the truth of Jesus remains the same. Same thing with the church calendar. I know we got to wrap up here, but in the church calendar, you revisit the story of Jesus every year, and you do it in 3-year cycles.
Yeah.
But people think, what else are you going to preach on, though? Really, you get the same text repeated over 3 years. Again, though, we are different. And when we talk about that, from previously as well, as coming forth when I'm in grief, I might not actually connect with Easter as much as I did the previous year. But I sure can connect with Jesus in the garden, weeping in the garden. And it does something to my memory when I see others rejoicing at Easter, to say, I remember when I rejoiced, and I believe that someday I'll rejoice again. I don't have it in me right now, but I can see through my sisters, through my brothers, and through my own memory of doing this before, that there's hope here. And the hope, again, is centered in the life and story of Jesus. So that's the move to me toward goodness. I like good music. I like good production. I like all of these things. But during the pandemic, the experiences I connected with at the deepest level were often over Zoom with pretty bad quality, or somebody getting on Facebook, or, you and I now joined some folks. I started this during the pandemic for Compline prayer of most nights, getting on and with these people that I didn't previously know, but we're just praying these prayers, these ancient prayers, night after night. And there was a beauty and a goodness in it. And that's what I'm interested in. I love good music. I want to make good music. But I want to hear people sing again. That's what I'm dying for, David, is I know I'm feeling emotional, but I miss people singing on Sundays, and I miss it for my kids too. That and I've seen, and I'll confess to you that I think I was part of the problem for years. Our music got better and better, and people sang less and less. But now, specifically, after the pandemic, I watched a video of the other night of this church filled with people and singing, and there's a good reason that we don't have that yet. Okay, and so I'm in agreement with that, but I long for it, and I long to be surrounded by the voices of people singing from the depths of their soul before God, because it's beyond me at that point. I'm caught up in something good, something beautiful, and something that will last.
Yeah. And so just what I'm hearing is attempt to kind of summarize some of the things that we've talked about is that, and as a if I can call myself a theologian, there's actually a real resonance for me. And one of the things you see in Scripture regularly is that we as humans are not overly trustworthy, right? And we all would agree to that. Go, humans are not very trustworthy. What that means is I can't always trust myself.
Yes.
So my own emotions, my own mental well-being, my own behavior won't always be trustworthy. And again, if I'm trying to echo what I think I'm hearing you saying, is that when we then have a structure, perhaps an ancient path, as Jeremiah calls it, something that's tried and true and tested. Yep. There's something about this structure that actually doesn't repress me, and that can sometimes be the language, can't it? Wait a minute, we're now saying some creeds together. We're now kind of structuring things a little bit differently. We're doing communion more regularly. All these questions of worship that might. In my context that I grew up in, it was definitely, well, that's all repressive. We are free and we can just do whatever we want. But actually, left to do whatever I want, it's invariably selfish and emotionally driven. So it feels to me like there's a sense of what we're saying is actually by leaning into some of the depths of structures that are out there and learning from that, it gives us a way. Like you take the Creed as an example, saying the Apostles' Creed every week reminds me of who Jesus is, but as a result reminds me of who I am as well,
Yes, yes.
and locks me into that sort of place. And yes, it might seem repetitive. Yes, it might seem overly structured. But when I'm faced with a pandemic, I don't have a lot of energy to be creative. I actually need
Mm.
something solid, tried, and true. So
Yes.
you use this phrase, which I really like. I wonder if you just say something about it, just as we sort of land. Is that essentially what the structure of things like creeds and all that do is they give us frames. They give us places to play within, but
Yeah.
a safety with their form. I mean, does that explain kind of where you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was looking at doing a small project with a good friend of mine on the creeds, and we were talking about the way in which, for the creeds, for example, they're not stifling. What they do is they provide the space that holds in the sand in the playground.
Right.
Otherwise, you don't have a playground. You have to have some kind of frame. Similarly, people talk about jazz.
Mm.
Even biblical scholars and theologians. Sometimes I'll read this stuff and like, okay, you don't know about music, but not you, David. These other ones, but you know, jazz music is what it isn't is a free for all. Um,
Mm.
Jazz music is highly structured.
Mm.
And because you know that structure, then you can have all the freedom within it. But people know typically where they're going. They might repeat that, in a pattern live.
Mm.
But you have to know all kinds of people. Don't just show up and play jazz, right?
Mm.
You have to know very serious music theory. You have to understand rhythm and chordal things, even the environment in which you play. Serious jazz musicians will tell you that's a thing. The physical environment in which you play, the
Mm.
particular piano which you're playing, all these things factor in. But you also have this is the form of the song. But when you know the form of the song and you know the theory behind the form of the song, you know
Mm.
all these things. Then there's this immense freedom that comes by being able to move freely within that. I mean, I could take this jazz metaphor way too far. The point simply being that that there is structure in jazz, and there is movement within that structure. There
Mm.
is a lot of play within that structure. But the reason that the best jazz musicians make it sound so free is because they know the form and they know the frame
Mm.
so well. And this to me is what good liturgy does in the church. Good liturgy, the church calendar, the creeds, how we come together on a Sunday morning, the table, all of these things, they're not stifling. They actually just provide the frame that allows the play, the Christ playing within our own lives and us
Yeah.
joining that play within the world. It teaches us how to move about in the world in beautiful and good ways. But we have to have that frame in
Mhm.
order to do that. And so that's what these things do. They provide that good frame whereby we can have beautiful and good freedom and movement within.
And I love the paradox of that because
Mm.
the narcissist in us, going back to what we said earlier, if Brooks is right, this narcissist journey that the Western world is on, just anything that sounds like restriction, I want to rail against. But I
Yeah,
love the way you've described that. Is actually if we dig into these ancient paths, they provide structure wherein we can play freely. So there's this
that's it.
paradox of boundary and freedom, which it just sounds beautiful. That if there's an invitation to say journey along with this, and also there's a sense, Phil, for me that if worship is corporate, then the
Mm.
corporate nature of worship isn't just found in the present, but somehow, I mean, we stand in 21st century Calgary and recite a creed that's been said for 1900 years by Christians across the world. The
Mm.
corporate level now starts to work backwards and forwards through history, not
Mm.
just sideways through the room that we're in. Which is why I love that Jeremiah text on on
Yes.
ancient paths. Like there's something tried and true about this journey where we can live and find some freedom in. I think it's beautiful. I
Mm,
think it's
mm,
beautiful. Well, Phil, thanks so much for sharing with us on that. For me, it's important that we just locate ourselves, that this is a journey which we'll come back to converse more about, but in an attempt as a community to say, what does post-pandemic worship look like in order to be
yeah.
good, and how do we set ourselves in a good place to navigate more uncertainty, because we're still, I say post-pandemic, I think we're still in the pandemic.
Yeah.
There's still new things to learn, and I really
Mm,
love the place that you're leading us in with that, to help us just find a sandbox wherein we can, meet the God that loves us and be
mm.
guided in worship to him. So thanks so much, Phil.
Pleasure.